Investigative journalist Tony Gosling joins us now from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, welcome to the program. In what has become the biggest Western expulsion of Russian diplomats since the height of the Cold War, I think it was pretty much expected to see the U.S. allies jumping on the bandwagon with this one.
Well, not necessarily if they were looking at the facts, because there's been a tremendous rush to judgment here. Look, what allies these 25 or so countries is a military alliance. They're all in military alliance together. None of the evidence that's been presented, which is actually very, very little, would stand up in court. Whatever happened to this whole idea of innocent until proven guilty? And yet a massive amount of expulsions. Really, when we're talking about over 100 diplomats altogether, I think what's happened is that there's been a decision before this has all taken place, this incident in Salisbury, that Russia was going to be the next target after Syria. I think this is actually a reaction to the Russian military victory in Syria, and that this is the way that the West has decided to respond. Of course, it did so just about 2 weeks before the presidential election, so the idea was an attempt also to affect those elections and to try and discredit Putin. But it's been incredible, really, how many lies and so little truth and facts has been interrogated in the British media. Really, no questions asked, and a massive rush to judgment. Another potential person behind this, rather than Putin, is the Russian mafia. Also, the UK Secret Services. Let's not forget that the Porton Down Centre is just 10 minutes drive away from Salisbury. I've had it confirmed to me by a former army officer that worked at Porton Down that they definitely had Novichok there. So that, to me, is the most obvious source. Now, the question is it the British mafia or the Russian mafia or the British Secret Service? And it seems incredible that there should have been such a rush to judgment over this.
And what is the end game to all of this, to this episode of tensions between the UK and the United States on one hand and Russia on the other?
Well, the end game, I think, is now regime change in Moscow. It might sound crazy, and of course that's not in Britain's interest, ordinary Britain's interest. Jonathan Marcus from the BBC this morning was saying that, well, Putin was responsible for the downing of MH17, the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine in 2014. He was also responsible for the Litvinenko poisoning in 2006. Look, the fact is, neither of those have been conclusively pinned on to Putin at all. I mean, there was even the British report itself said Putin and Russia was probably responsible for the Litvinenko poisoning. They couldn't even bring themselves to say it was. So what you see is a mixing up of fact and speculation by the entire Western press. And you know what that makes them? That makes them conspiracy theorists. No, what worries me is that this is very similar to the run-up to the regime change in Libya and the attacks on Colonel Gaddafi. For example, the murder of Yvonne Fletcher outside the Libyan embassy in 1984 in London, and the Lockerbie attack in 1988. Both of those were pinned by the British media onto the Libya. And neither of them were actually by Libya. So what's happening now is a whole bunch of fabricated stories. We're talking about MH17, Litvinenko, now this Skripal case, are being pinned onto Russia. And it's got nothing to do, I think, with the Russians at all. Also, Skripal wanted to return to Russia. His letters were blocked that were going to the Kremlin. This would have not pleased MI6, who he was working with, at all, because he would have gone back to Russia and he would have been chatting to all his old KGB, FSB friends about how MI6 was operating, because he was in very close touch with them here in Britain. There is a motive for the British Secret Service to stop him doing anything, because that's not what they wanted. So we've seen no photos and evidence. We're just waiting on the word of the British government.
Indeed.
And the word of Porton Down. Porton Down can't be trusted. We have 35 victims of Porton Down, British Army soldiers that died at Porton Down, and the government took something like 10 years and gave them a paltry amount of compensation. So we know we can't trust these people. I don't know why all these other nations are trusting them. I think it's just the latest bogeyman, Saddam Hussein, Colonel Gaddafi, President Assad, and now it's Vladimir Putin.
Thank you very much. Investigative journalist Tony Gosling joining us from Bristol.